It's now my pleasure to introduce François Hartog, who's going to give a concluding paper, who's well known as the author of a great number of books, focusing in part on classical antiquity, translated to English as The Memories of Odysseus and The Mirror of Herodotus, and more recently on particularly 19th century historiography, but also contemporary, and the contemporary conditions, the historical conditions under which history is written. He studied with Jean-Pierre Vernon, who was just mentioned here, and started his career at the universities of Strasbourg and Metz, and has since 1987 been directeur d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, where he is the chair of ancient and modern historiography. The title of his paper is From Experience to History.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Stefan and Charles, for organizing such a meeting, such a conference, and inviting me to take part in it. Because I think that such a conference would have been impossible organized by historians. And that's, I find it especially interesting. And to look at the question of history through the problem of historical experience. And there is something which struck me in our meeting. Suppose that such a meeting took place in Europe. I think it would have been very different. Even if we suppose that we have two anthropologists who are ready to organize such a meeting in Europe, I think it would have been different, because I was struck, as I said, by the emphasis on the reenactment in different papers given. And I don't think that the same thing would have occurred in Europe, and well, you have to cope with your own genocide. I mean, the Indian genocide, and in Europe we have to cope with different genocide, and the last, not the last one, but the most terrible one, the Shoah, with which we are still dealing strongly. The question is, why now? And I come back to what Charles said yesterday about this diagram, and why all these questions of reenactment or memory or comes at the surface now. If you look at this diagram, you have this moment around 1800, okay? And I think that, of course, you have many factors which play a role, but among the conditions which made possible this change in what history is, you have the dramatic change which occurred with the experience of time in around 1800, between, let's say, 1780 up to 1840 or 50. And that the moment when the way in which you articulate the three categories of the past, the present, and the future is changing. And if you had before, I mean, it's very schematic what I'm saying now, but maybe it might be useful. Before, the emphasis was on the category of the past. And that does not mean that people were living in the past, but the fact that means that the light comes from the past. And when you want to understand what's going on right now, you first start by looking toward the past in order to find models, examples, and of course the great tool is imitation. And that means that in what I call this ancient regime of historicity, history is one discourse among others dealing with the past. And you have many other discourses or practice or whatever which gives you, which are able to give you indication about the way you have to behave or what is good to do. And history does not pretend to have a monopoly. But things change after 1800, and the future becomes the place where the light comes from. And you have a very, I think it very illuminating, so to speak, phrase by Tocqueville. At the end of the democracy in America, so that means written around 1840, you have this phrase, when the past no longer illuminates the future, l'esprit walks in darkness. Okay, and that's precisely what happened. The spirit walked in darkness, and what did Tocqueville do? He traveled to the future, and from the future, from America, he could see what was the future of Europe. So, in a way, he transferred the old model of Historia Magistra from the past to the future. But in a way, the structure remained the same. And from now on, when you want to know what to do, you first look in direction of the future. And the future illuminates the present and the past. That means also that you know what you have to retain and what you can forget, which is not useful, which is no longer useful. The past is dead. Or what part of the past is dead, you know, for sure. But of course, things are not so sharply cut. If I'm thinking, for example, of Michelet, the great historian of the middle of the 19th century, and Michelet is, in a way, divided into parts. One of him is totally in the future-oriented, and this takes the form of the revolution and the people, and the march of the people, and the light of the revolution. But on the other hand, you had the revolution, you had the failure of the revolution, and he developed this very strong definition of a historian and the one who is in charge of the dead. And he developed this and of course the historian is in charge of the dead, and history is resurrection. This model is founded upon the idea that you have a debt toward the past and toward the dead. They are waiting for you. They are waiting for you to say what they were not able to say. That you have very strong, very famous pages of Michelet about that. So that means that, yes, the future is in charge, and you have to go as fast as possible toward the future. But at the same time, he is very conscious of this definition of the task of the historian. But I see that my time is running out, and I did not even start. But it doesn't matter. I mean, I shall stop when you say I shall stop.
Go ahead.
And because I have to arrive to the present, to the second part of your diagram. Why now? I mean, and I think, well, I would like to add still one thing, because there is some paradox, some sort of paradox. As I said, from now on, lights comes from the future. Okay, that means that the old model of Historia Magistra is no longer valid. But that's at the moment where the light comes from the future, that history proclaims that history is a science of the past, which was not the case before. So the modern concept of history is very much future oriented. Okay, but that's when you have this future oriented definition of what history is. At the same time, for various reasons, history, which wanted to be counted among sciences on the model of natural sciences in the 50s and 1850s, 70s, 80s, start to say, I am only the science of the past, and I have nothing to do with the present. And not only I have nothing to do with the present, but I put a sharp cut, divide between past and present. Okay, so that's, I mean, it's quite understandable, but it looks like some paradox at the first glance. But so when we arrive now at let's say 1970, more or less, we could say, if I use Tocqueville's phrase, we could say that we enter a period where the future no longer illuminates the past. And that, what does that mean? That means that in a way we have only the present left. And that's what I call the presentism, which is not exactly the meaning the word has in English. What I call presentism, that means that we have only the present, and a celebration of the present, and a cult for a while of the present. And so, if the future no longer illuminates the past, you no longer seize what you have to retain, to forget, what to do with the past. And I think that all the memory wave, which starts around the 1970s, at least in Europe, is a manifestation of that, an expression of that. That is, memory is at the same time the manifestation of this strong presence of the present, of this because memory is the convocation, the evocation of something of the past into the present. So that's one side. But on the other side, memory is also a way to escape from this omnipresent present. And so it's both, I think. What else? And I think all these phenomena that we are living through are, I mean, I don't pretend that the only explanations, but have something to do with this change in our experience of time. That means that we no longer know how to articulate past, present, and future. And I think that the question is there. So, how much time do I have left?
It's now 12:30. We have at least 15 minutes for this session. 15 minutes.
So that means that it's better that I stop and we discuss.
I think you might have, including the discussion period of 10 minutes, you have about almost 10 more minutes. I mean, then we can start discussing your paper and then a general discussion at 45.
Well, but perhaps I'm not going to go into my paper. I mean, you can read it anyway. So, to come back to things which have been said during the conference about the question of genre, which you introduced yesterday. I think it might be interesting to look at it from far away, from not in time. I mean, I think if you start, because if you start from, not to go too far, because we have not much time, to start with Aristotle, which is quite recent. No, but with if you open the rhetoric of Aristotle, you will read that we have three genres of discourse: the deliberative, the judiciary, and the epidictic, and three only. So the question is, where do you put history? And historians were extremely worried by that. And some of them tried to say, but there is a fourth one, historical genre, but they did not succeed. That means, and I'm not going to develop that, but that means that from that time, history had problems with where to locate itself. What kind of discourse is it? And the historians fight extremely strongly in order to avoid to be absorbed in the big bag of epidictic discourse. And they had always to say, no, what we do is totally different. What we do, it's very difficult to be an historian. You have to work hard, and so and so. So that means that the danger was quite real. And another way to avoid the trap of epidictic was to say, precisely to develop this dimension of historia magistra vitae. We are useful. We are practical, moral. And if you read what we wrote, what we write, you will be better people. And you have, it's very clear with Polybius, and it's very clear, and it also with Plutarch, of course, who is the master of these, that. But I simply had some complication. One supplementary complication is when with Rome and with Cicero, where you have this problematic proposition. First, history does not belong to rhetoric. Why? Because rhetoric is serious business. Rhetoric has to do with the forum, with the osium, with the negocium. Okay, and history is for pleasure. So history is for osium. Okay. So what do? You are there for the pleasure. But at the same time, Cicero says that the one who will be the best historian, who is in capacity of being the best historian, is the orator. That means himself, the orator, because rhetoric wants to put his hands on the epidictic discourse, and as such, history is put on the side of the epidictic discourse, and that means that it has to be under the control of the orator. And in a way, I don't say all the debate, but the way in which this question of relation between rhetoric and history comes from there. And of course it was reformulated many times and up to Hayden White. But I think that the difficulties or the knot, so to speak, comes from there. So this question of genre has a very long story, and with real things at stake in that. I mean, that's not simply a literary game. Than in that. Well, probably I think I'd stop there.
We have time for questions. Yes.
So it hadn't occurred to me until you spoke, but so we've been talking. A lot of us have been interested in these historical living history reenactments, and historians have been arguing whether or not they have anything to do with history. But in reference to Aristotle, should they be best, in fact, understood as epidictic discourses? That is to say, as akin to ancient funeral orations, panegyrics, essentially complex, enacted ritual practices that aim at praiseworthiness or blameworthiness. I mean, is that what they are? It's related to deixis, right? So that they're about the idea that you're positioning these kinds of actions in terms of a particular set of speakers or actors, like at the beginning of the ancient Olympic Games or something like that, in reference to what was right in the past and how that might affect the present and the future. And that would seem to characterize a lot of the historical reenactments we've been talking about.
But I don't see the link with Aristotle in what you are saying.
So,
because you have only three genres of discourse,
right,
and the deliberative is oriented toward the future.
Right.
The judiciary is oriented toward the past, and the epidictic is for the present.
Right, but it's a present, yeah, but it seems to me that it's a present that is making reference, in funeral orations or editors and
yeah.
Others here know much more about
it's
it.
more performative, maybe.
It's performative, right?
Yeah.
But it's to establish what is right conduct and what is wrong conduct. Isn't that it? And it seems to me that's what's going on in a lot of the activity of reenactment. I hadn't thought of it before.
Yeah, but from the point of view of Aristotle and others, that means that epileptic is for the present, and so the only one thing which is important is to please the audience, and to present yourself. I mean, the author or the orator, to present himself as a very good orator. So which is at stake is the present moment of the performance, and nothing else. In the narrow definition of the genre, that doesn't.
Yeah, François, I wanted to get back to the change that you located in maybe the first 30, 40 years of the 19th century, when that old trope of Historia Magistra Vitae finally broke down. I mean, you can, for example, still see it, when you look at the Federalist papers, which is full of references trying to sort of, seek wisdom from antiquity. And it's gone by the time that Marx writes the 18th Brumaire, which, is very, Tocqueville, sort of contemporary to that, like Marx, wants to take a trip to the future. I mean, the revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future.
Yeah.
So, but concurrent to that is a kind of a stream of discourse which we haven't really talked so much about, and it ties into some of the papers we heard earlier today, and that is 19th century biblical criticism, such as Renan or later Troeltsch, Robertson Smith in England, which actually does exactly, it seems to me at least, establish the basis for the kind of argumentation that Marshall was arguing against, and and which towards the end of the 19th century actually did lead to the kind of so-called crisis of historicism that Troeltsch himself, had in a sense laid the groundwork for that precise diagnosis was so worrying about towards the end of his life, and that's props maybe also under the influence of Nietzsche, one would imagine, who's part and parcel of that whole syndrome, of course. So in a sense, if we are, if I understand you right, and for example, the rise of the memory boom, or memory as a meta-historical category, to put it in more precise terms, things like reenactments, the very fact that we are talking here about the varieties of historical experience. Are we having sort of a kind of a repeat performance of a crisis of historicism in the sense that you call it presentism?
Yes. I would say rather yes. Of course, the forms it takes are different, but consider under this question of biblical studies is has something to with strict linked with this transformation of the experience of time and of time itself, because that's precisely the moment also where the biblical chronology became absolutely unsustainable at that time.
1840s again.
And the wish to come back to the biblical chronology is a reaction to that. I mean, the way they refused what I call the modern regime of historicity, and they are absolutely lost in this extraordinary development of time behind us with 14 billion of years, and also in front of us. And I think that's another dimension of that, of the problem of today, because of the fact that we discover that the future is in a way closed, but at the same time, the future is already, partly at least, played, because from what we do today, or we do not do today, and that's all the debates about climate warming and the nuclear waste. And I don't know if there is any debate here about the nuclear waste, but there is a...
Yeah, we don't like it.
Yes. Yeah, that's a position, of course.
Remember, it all started right here.
But the problem is that what to do, because you have some, and for example, in Europe and in France, you have debate, and I was asked to take part in what they call citizen debate. And it's impossible to imagine what does that mean, that something which is here now, right now, will have effect in 10,000 of years. How do you deal with that? That's a problem which is absolutely new for the humankind. I mean, we simply don't know. And it's very interesting to see how the people in charge of that, that's a government agency. No, agency, no, you don't say it well.
Agency.
Well, okay. And how they try to think to how, so they try to have some sort of eternal paper, which, in order to be able to leave a message for the people in 30,000 years from now, or they think of, but probably if they are not able to read what our scripture, how can we do? So they imagine some sort of new language and so on. So they try to cope with that, but they can't in a way. And it's very, and people, these citizens are become aware of that, and they say, look, before to put all these dirty things 5,000 meters down, perhaps it would be good to think a bit more about that, and whether it's good to have to produce things like that any longer.
So in a sense, could one say, if sort of like by the middle of the 19th century, kind of the bottom had fallen out of the sort of short biblical chronology and opened up to this abyss of time, prompting people, prompting a whole wave of creationism, like, Edmund Goss arguing that the fossils were just in the ground because God created them to test our faith. Then, by this point, after a short detour through what Fukuyama called the end of history, we're sort of experiencing the bottom fell out then, now the top has lifted, so to speak.
Yeah, sure.
I think we probably have time for one more question, and then we'll go to the... Okay?
One more. Keep it brief.
I had a question about the following on this notion of the past, present, and future, which recalls to my mind an interesting article by Alumni House where he talks about the fact that the memory boom is about our failure to imagine the future. But one of the things that's linked to, of course, is the question of narrative and the question of the grand narratives. You mentioned 1989, and I think we're now beginning to witness the emergence, perhaps, of a new sort of narrative based around the question of the deep history and the climate change. But I'm just interested at the level when you said you go back to Aristotle, I actually thought you go back to the Poetics and talk about narrative.
Yeah.
Because the narrative as a tool.
I didn't have time to do
you
that.
Didn't have time, okay. But the beginning, middle, and end, the notion that there are extended presents, and they're not just extended in the nature of the same, always the same extension, but rather in the mode of difference and of change and of development. That seems to be a key tool to the way in which we have been understanding time as an point of articulation between past, present, and future. And what strikes me in this discussion about experience, how very, indeed, how we fall into the question of presentism in the sense of perhaps of associating it with the visual, and the visual as a picture, rather than the visual as a narrative of in the audiovisual sense. And what I'd be interested to hear is more about how we can think about the relationship between experience as being in the moment and the role of narrative as a way of extending that moment into an understanding of development. And ironically, this morning's session, it was very much present there in our, perhaps not ironically, but it was very strikingly present in the arcs and structure of the arc, which was typically Aristotelian in the beginning, middle, and end, right? And then and so, but this is a structure which is a way of dealing with experience in a mode of development and in a mode of futurity, because it's also opening out a perspective onto a new world in which change has occurred. And so I'd be very interested in rethinking in all the papers, in fact, this is perhaps more of a comment on a question to you, in terms of this notion of narrative.
Yeah.
And perhaps the question to you is, why didn't you use the word narrative?
Why?
Why didn't you come to the question of narrative? Is it just because you don't think it's relevant, or just a category that's
I think the question that quite relevant. I did not do it now, but it's there in the book Believing in History, which there is a whole chapter about that. So no, and what I think of course interesting to look at is the way in which we the narrative, and if we take, of course, the great novel of the 19th century with Scott in a very good place there, you have this. I mean, in a way, the modern novel, 19th century up to 1940, I would say, more or less, was based upon this desire to say this historical world, this new historical world, and in a way they share this what I call modern regime of historicity, but on a different mode that from the historians. I mean, in a way, the historians of the 19th century and beginning of the 20s were more futurist, so to speak, than the novelists, than the writers, because the writers have, I think, always been more interested by the ruptures, by the discrepancies, by the gaps. That's what interests them. Even if you can find that in Balzac, for example, with the Colonel Chabert and things like that. But you see this falling down, so to speak, of this kind of narrative with Robert Musil and with around 1940. And I think that Musil, among many things, testified that what he called the classical récit, the classical narrative, is no longer possible. And after 1945, that's still more true. And that's the moment where we proclaim especially in France, the end of the novel. And it took, and it's only in the 10, 20 past years, that something like a novel, I mean, written by real writers, not by people who simply write books, but start again, but on a very different basis. And they try to develop some new kind of narratives. But all the period of the new, what was the so-called nouveau roman, is the celebration of this end of the novel, the impossibility to say, to write, to narrate anything.
Well, thank you very much.